Ethan Blake hadn't relocated to the city's edge for tranquility, though in a sense, that was exactly what he received. His residence perched atop a hill where an old gravel path meandered like a serpent through thick pine woods. Over the years, he had invested every penny into securing his property, constructing his own stronghold with towering walls, strategically placed cameras, concealed angles, and motion-activated lights that flickered to life whenever wildlife approached too closely. For Ethan, the estate was both his sanctuary and a barrier against something he would never openly admit. He didn't require protection from men like himself, individuals who had spent years navigating the murky waters of ethical ambiguity. Such men didn't simply retire, they left behind unresolved and messy affairs that had a tendency to return like scavengers. Ethan's wealth stemmed from ventures that were never discussed over dinner, under-the-table agreements, problem-solving, and businesses thriving in legal loopholes. He had amassed his fortune but lost his moral compass. When the moment came to vanish, he chose that very path leading to nowhere and established a boundary he believed no one could breach. The first time Ethan encountered the spikes, he couldn't believe his eyes. It was nearly midnight, and the only noise was the gravel crunching under his tires as he navigated the final bend towards his home. He almost overlooked the thin black metal strips lying innocently across the road just before the gates, but a flash from his headlights revealed them, the sharp points glinting like jagged fangs. He slammed the brakes, the tires screeching to a halt a mere foot away. For a moment, he sat there, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly enough to make it creak, staring at the spikes as if they were a mirage conjured by his weary mind. Yet, they were undeniably real. Rudimentary industrial-grade tire spikes driven into the ground with such precision that it made his stomach churn. Ethan turned off the ignition and exited the car, the heavy night air pressing against his chest. His boots crunched on the gravel as he crouched to examine the metal. They were firmly anchored, deliberately placed. Someone had orchestrated this, and worse, someone had been present. Standing up, he scanned the surrounding forest on both sides of the road. The darkness gazed back at him, vast and impenetrable. His eyes searched the tree line for any sign of movement, but the woods remained eerily silent. Too silent. His lights only highlighted the tree edges, their branches sagging under the darkness. He knew every inch of his property. No one could approach this closely without triggering his alarms or setting off one of his meticulously arranged deterrents. There they were, these spikes, as if challenging him. Ethan Blake didn't respond well to challenges. It took him an hour to remove the spikes. He worked in silence, sweat dripping from his brow as his tools clanged against the metal. Once the last piece was free, he tossed it into the brush, his breath heavy with frustration. He left the road damaged and uneven, but clear by the time he shut the gate behind him, locking it with a loud click. He reassured himself it was probably nothing, perhaps a prank or some disgruntled neighbors. The HOA members had always been a nuisance, complaining about his property being an eyesore or criticizing his refusal to adhere to their nonsensical regulations. Ethan didn't care. He skipped their meetings and ignored their correspondence. He had no HOA contracts or fees to worry about. His road was his road, legally purchased along with the property years ago, and no one could dictate its use to him. However, as he tried to dismiss the incident, a nagging voice told him someone was testing him. The next morning, Ethan discovered an envelope nestled in his gate. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper with embossed lettering at the top. Homeowners Association. He scoffed and tore it open, scanning the contents with increasing disbelief. Unauthorized removal of HOA-installed safety infrastructure. A fine of $12,500 has been issued under Section 19B of Community Compliance Regulations. Repeat offenses may lead to legal action. Ethan reread the letter twice. Safety infrastructure? It seemed like a joke. He crumpled the paper in his fist and threw it into his truck's cabin. He didn't have time for games. By the afternoon, the spikes were back, this time driven even deeper with the heads painted dark to blend into the gravel. Ethan stood over them, seething. He realized the HOA had overstepped, finding him for issues that didn't concern him. Tall grass along his fence, a shed not meeting aesthetic standards, mailboxes painted the wrong shade of beige. He had ignored every notice, assuming they would tire of pestering him. But this was different. They were on his road, his property. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across his yard, Ethan sat on his porch, vigilantly watching the road like a hawk. A cigarette smoldered between his fingers as he pondered how they had managed it. Who was trespassing on his land? His cameras covered his house and surrounding property, but the long, winding road remained a blind spot. He had always assumed it was too remote for anyone to bother. He crushed the cigarette on the wooden railing, his jaw tightening. If they wanted a confrontation, they had chosen the wrong man. But that night, something changed. Around 2 a.m., Ethan was awakened by an unfamiliar sound. A dull metallic scrape, faint but distinct. He moved quietly, slipping out of bed and grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand. The house was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. Outside, the trees swayed, casting jittery shadows on the ground. Ethan crept to the porch's edge and waited. He heard the scrape again, followed by a faint clink. His flashlight snapped on, casting a beam across the road, but there was nothing, just an empty stretch of gravel. Ethan swept the light back and forth, his heart pounding in his chest for the first time in years. A sense of unease settled in his gut. Someone was out there, just beyond the light's reach, watching and waiting. He stepped off the porch, holding the flashlight like a weapon, and approached the road. Whatever this was, it wasn't a prank anymore. And whoever they were was about to learn just how dangerous it was to provoke a man like Ethan Blake. Ethan woke to the harsh sound of metal scraping against metal, piercing the quiet dawn like a serrated blade. The noise was faint, carried by the wind and filtered through his double-pane windows, but unmistakable. He jolted out of bed, heart racing, instinctively reaching for the heavy flashlight he kept beside him. Still groggy, he paused, straining to hear. Silence enveloped the house again, heavy and oppressive. Ethan knew what he had heard wasn't just in his head. Someone or something was out there. He didn't bother putting on a coat, stepping onto the porch in a t-shirt, sweatpants, and boots. The cold morning air bit at his skin, but he ignored it. A thin fog rolled along the tree line, twisting like tendrils across the road, giving everything an eerie, distorted appearance. Ethan aimed his flashlight toward the gravel path leading to his gate, and there they were. The spikes were back, but different this time. He approached closer, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and crouched to inspect them. Unlike before, the spikes were no longer thin black strips scattered randomly across the gravel. These were welded into metal plates with a sinister polish, their razor-sharp tips pointing upward like trap jaws. They had been drilled and secured into the ground with industrial bolts. Someone had meticulously worked under the cover of night while Ethan slept. His jaw clenched as he realized that they weren't just trying to provoke him. This was war. His flashlight beam landed on a newly planted sign just beyond the spikes. It hadn't been there the day before, a professionally made placard staked into the earth with surgical precision, declared in bold white letters, "Gravel Path HOA Safety Installation. Tampering is a criminal offense." Ethan exhaled sharply, the audacity of it almost making him laugh. HOA safety installation? Who did they think they were fooling? This wasn't a safety measure. It was a land grab, a power play. He could almost hear the smug voice of Laura Davis, HOA president, reciting some archaic bylaw to justify invading his property. Ethan had seen it all before. Petty tyrants using rules as weapons, twisting them to get what they wanted. But the HOA had made a grave mistake by underestimating him. Ethan grabbed a crowbar from his garage and began to work. It wasn't easy. The spikes were deeply anchored and bolted down to resist removal. He struggled against the metal, muscles straining with each pull. By the time he pried the first plate loose, the sun had risen, and his breath came in labored bursts, sweat mingling with the cold air chilling him to the bone. He continued ripping up plate after plate until the road was clear once more. His palms were raw, his back aching, but a sharp satisfaction settled in his chest. Tossing the last plate into the ditch, Ethan noticed something odd beneath the gravel where the spikes had been embedded, thin wires snaking through the earth toward the tree line. He frowned, brushing away more gravel with his fingers. The wires were old and frayed in spots, but they seemed to disappear into the underbrush, buried just out of sight. Someone had gone to great lengths to set this up, and Ethan began to wonder just how deep their plans went. That's when the engine noise started. A car was approaching. Ethan turned his head sharply, spotting the familiar shimmer of a black sedan rolling up the road toward his gate. It was the HOA again. Without even seeing the tinted windows or Laura Davis's smug expression behind the wheel, he knew it. Sure enough, as the vehicle stopped, Laura stepped out, dressed impeccably as always, a crisp beige blazer, a pencil skirt, and that ever-present smile of hers, too wide to be genuine, too sharp to be comforting. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," Laura called, her voice syrupy with condescension. Ethan leaned on the crowbar, chest heaving slightly from exertion. "Laura?" He replied flatly. She gestured to the torn-up road and the ditch now littered with metal plates. "It seems you've been busy. Your people placed this on my road." Ethan's voice was low, simmering with restrained fury. "Without my permission." Laura shook her head softly. "Mr. Blake, as you know, the HOA is responsible for ensuring the safety of all residents in the area. Several complaints were filed about your road, the speed, the lack of regulation. It was decided that safety measures were necessary to protect the community." Ethan barked a bitter laugh. "What community? This is my land, my road. I have the deed and you know it." Laura's smile didn't falter. "With all due respect, Mr. Blake, we've already filed an adjustment to your property boundaries. The HOA has claimed jurisdiction over this road as part of the larger development." Ethan gripped the crowbar tighter. "That's theft, not regulation." Her tone hardened slightly. "I'd advise you to tread carefully. Destroying HOA property is a violation that carries significant fines. Removing those spikes could be interpreted as vandalism, or worse, obstruction of safety protocols. Do you really want to escalate this?" Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Laura's smile faltered for a brief second as he loomed over her, the crowbar dangling loosely in his hand. "Tell whoever's behind this that if they come onto my property again, there won't be a next time." Laura's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, all semblance of politeness slipped away. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, almost threateningly, "you really should consider cooperating. It would make things easier." Ethan didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Laura and her subordinates idling by the gate. As he disappeared behind the door, he glanced at the cameras mounted along his porch. The footage was clear, capturing every word and movement inside. Pouring himself a cup of black coffee, his hands still trembling slightly with anger, he stared out the window toward the now empty road. Laura's words echoed in his mind. Cooperating would make things easier. That wasn't a warning, it was a threat, and Ethan Blake didn't take kindly to threats. He set the coffee down and reached for his phone. If Laura thought she could outmaneuver him, she was in for a surprise. Ethan didn't play fair, not then, not now. He wasn't about to let anyone take what was his. Ethan spent the rest of the day reinforcing his boundaries. He didn't trust Laura Davis, nor did he believe her flimsy explanations about safety protocols and community concerns. The plates, the spikes, and the wires weren't installed to protect anyone. It was deliberate intimidation. The HOA didn't want Ethan to cooperate. They wanted him to submit, and that was something he simply couldn't do. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had driven the battered remnants of the metal plates to the far end of his property and dumped them into an old ravine. If Laura or her cronies planned to return for their hardware, they'd have to wade through brambles and mud to retrieve it. He ensured the spike traps were gone for good, but his gut told him this was only the beginning. People like Laura never backed down after the first push. They doubled their efforts. That suspicion was confirmed at exactly 4 a.m. when Ethan's alarm blared, jolting him out of bed. The harsh mechanical wail echoed through the house like a relentless warning. He grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, moving with practice speed toward the control panel. The motion sensors near the gate were flashing red. Someone was there. Ethan checked the live feed from his cameras and froze. 3 figures in dark clothing stood by the gate, working swiftly to reattach something to the road. One crouched with a cordless drill, sparks flying as he drove screws into the gravel. Another watched the tree line, and the third planted a new sign in the dirt. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he zoomed in on the lettering. HOA Installation Zone. Private access restricted. Trespassing will result in legal action. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at the screen, the shotgun heavy in his hands. The audacity of it all. These weren't pranksters or vandals. They were professionals. The way they moved, the way they kept watch, it was clear they'd done this before. Laura had sent a crew to undo his work, counting on him to sleep through it. Not tonight. Ethan threw on a coat and stepped outside into the freezing darkness, the shotgun slung over his shoulder. The forest was silent except for the hum of their drill and the pale moonlight reflecting faintly off the bolts they'd already secured into the road. He stayed in the shadows as he approached, moving down the slight incline toward the gate. One of the men turned abruptly, sensing something, and shined a flashlight toward the trees. Ethan froze behind a thick pine, holding his breath until the beam passed over him and moved on. Almost done, the man with the drill muttered, "Good, I don't want to be here all night." Another replied, "This guy's a lunatic." Ethan's lip curled, so they were scared of him. Good. He moved closer, silent and steady, until he was just beyond the clearing's edge. With deliberate slowness, he stepped out of the shadows. The men lost the flashlight, which whipped toward him, momentarily blinding him. Before one could react, one of them shouted, "Who the hell?" Ethan's voice was calm. Even he leveled the shotgun across his chest, not aiming yet, but making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "You've got 10 seconds to pack your things and leave my property." The man with the flashlight hesitated, glancing toward his partner. "We're with the HOA. I don't care if you're with the FBI," he replied. Ethan interrupted. "You're trespassing now. Get out." One of the younger, cockier men stepped forward with his hands raised. "Hey, easy there, buddy. We're just doing our jobs. No need for—" Before he could finish, Ethan chambered around with a mechanical clack, silencing him mid-sentence. "You're down to 5 seconds." The men exchanged glances, realizing he wasn't bluffing. The one with the drill dropped the tool, it clattering against the gravel. All right, he said, backing away. "We're going to take the sign with you." Ethan added, "And tell Laura Davis that if she sends anyone else onto my land, they won't walk out so easily next time." The men scrambled to gather their tools, ripping the freshly planted sign from the dirt. Ethan watched as they piled into a black truck parked just outside the gate and sped off, tires kicking up gravel. The engine's rumble faded into the distance, leaving Ethan alone in the cold. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away. His road was scarred again, littered with half-secured bolts and tools left behind in their hurried escape. It was a mess, but it was his mess. For now, it was clear. Ethan turned back toward the house, knowing this wasn't over. Laura wouldn't back down. If anything, it would embolden her. People like Laura didn't know when to stop, and that was what made them dangerous. Sure enough, the next morning, Ethan found a legal notice taped to his gate. This time, the envelope sat neatly in his mailbox, handed to him by someone bold enough to step onto his property unnoticed. The paper inside was thicker than usual, printed on the same fancy stationery as before. Notice of violation. You are hereby accused of obstructing HOA operations, interfering with safety infrastructure, and threatening association contractors. Fines are listed below, totaling nearly $12,000. Signed, Laura Davis. Ethan crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. Fines meant nothing to him. They couldn't touch his land with money alone. and he knew Laura didn't have the legal right to install those spikes in the first place. But it wasn't about the fines or the spikes. It was about control, about testing him until he either submitted or lashed out. Ethan had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of either. That night, Ethan sat on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, watching the road. The forest was quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the clearing. His shotgun rested against the wall beside him, loaded and ready. Laura thought she could outsmart him, intimidate him with her petty rules and hired thugs. But she made a critical mistake. She invaded his land and declared war without understanding the kind of man he was up against. Ethan Blake wasn't afraid of people like Laura Davis. He had dealt with worse in his lifetime. Sharks and slick suits, grifters who smiled while they stripped you of everything you were worth. Compared to them, Laura was just another pretender with a clipboard and a superiority complex. But there was something more to this. The wires, the tools, the way her men had operated with practiced silence. It felt orchestrated, calculated. This wasn't just about the HOA. Something else was at play. As he sat there, staring at the darkened road, Ethan made himself a promise. If Laura wanted a fight, he'd give her one. But he wouldn't just fight back. He'd dismantle her operation entirely. Whatever game she was playing, whatever power she thought she held, Ethan Blake was going to take it all away from her piece by piece, making her regret ever stepping onto his land. Ethan knew the men would return, but what unsettled him most was how quickly they worked like clockwork. Laura Davis had connections, that much was certain, but her precision and the calculated movements of her hired hands indicated something bigger. These weren't overzealous HOA enforcers slapping fines on residents for having unapproved flowers in their yards. This was systematic. He spent the next day combing through his property, determined to uncover whatever Laura thought she owned. His boots sank into the frost-coated earth as he followed the same thin wires he had discovered beneath the gravel where the spikes had been anchored. With a small spade in hand, he dug carefully, unraveling the line like a spider's web. After 20 minutes, the wires led him to something that made his blood run cold. A small metallic device partially buried in a shallow trench beneath the foliage. It was no bigger than a shoebox, dark gray with the faint hum of active electronics. The logo stamped on the surface was one he hadn't seen in years, Secure Tech Solutions. Ethan muttered under his breath. Secure Tech wasn't your ordinary tech supplier. Years ago, when Ethan still associated with less than reputable circles, they had been at the center of a corporate surveillance scandal, installing safety equipment in private areas that doubled as monitoring systems. Their reach was extensive, their hands greasy with enough money to bury lawsuits before they saw the light of day. Ethan had a sinking feeling that the wires and devices weren't just about installing spikes to slow traffic. They were about surveillance. He carried the device back to his garage, slamming it onto the workbench under the flickering overhead bulb. There was no obvious way to open it. No screws, no panels. Whoever built it ensured it couldn't be taken apart with a screwdriver. He turned it over, inspecting every inch, and noticed a faint blinking light beneath the casing, a red LED pulsing like a heartbeat. GPS tracker, Ethan realized. They'd been watching him. "You want to play games, Laura?" He growled, his voice a low rumble in the garage's silence. Fine, he thought. Reaching for a pair of wire cutters and a roll of industrial tape, Ethan rigged the device. He took his truck 10 miles into town and stopped beneath an overpass. There. He tucked the device beneath the axle of a rusted-out van that hadn't moved in years. Its tires were sunken, and the windows were covered in grime. If Laura's people wanted to track his movements, they'd get a hell of a surprise trying to follow him through abandoned lots and junkyards. That night, Ethan sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, eyes fixed on the road. His cameras were running, motion sensors armed. If Laura sent her men again, he'd be ready. But by midnight, the forest remained silent, the road untouched. No SUVs rolled up to his gate, no sparks from drills lit the darkness. It was almost disappointing. Ethan had been itching for a fight. The next morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't taped to the gate this time. The envelope sat neatly in his mailbox, handed to him by someone who had been bold enough to step onto his property unnoticed. The paper inside was thicker than usual, embossed with gold HOA lettering. Ethan skimmed the contents, his jaw tightening with every line. Notice of legal action. Due to your failure to comply with HOA safety standards and regulations, and for engaging in the destruction of community property, the association has filed an emergency injunction restricting access to your property under Section 18C of Regional Development Law. Further failure to comply will result in foreclosure proceedings. Ethan's hands crumpled the letter before he could stop himself. Foreclosure on his property, the audacity of it stunned him. Even knowing how far Laura was willing to go, this wasn't just Laura anymore. The involvement of Secure Tech Solutions confirmed what Ethan had suspected. This was bigger than HOA politics. Someone wanted his land. He needed leverage. Ethan didn't waste time. He loaded his truck with equipment, bolt cutters, floodlights, even an old hunting rifle he hadn't touched in years, and headed back to the tree line where the device had been buried. If Secure Tech had been careless enough to leave one wire uncovered, there had to be more. Sure enough, an hour of digging revealed a network of cables stretching deeper into his property, leading farther up the ridge. When Ethan finally reached the end of the line, his breath caught. Tucked into a clearing, hidden from view and surrounded by trees on all sides, sat a small steel utility shed. Its exterior was painted dark to blend with the forest, and a thick padlock secured the double doors with no markings to indicate its purpose. Ethan crouched low, inspecting the ground around the shed. Fresh tire tracks suggested recent activity. Whatever was inside wasn't meant to be found. Rolling his shoulders and gripping the bolt cutters, Ethan muttered, "Let's see what's so important." The padlock snapped with a metallic crack, and Ethan pushed the doors open. The interior was Spartan, lit only by the pale glow of a single monitor mounted on a metal desk. It displayed a map of his property, his road, and several marked areas highlighted in red. Cameras, microphones. The entire ridge had been wired for surveillance, and judging by the timestamp on the feed, they were still live. Ethan's pulse raced as he leaned closer, scanning the data on the screen. Laura hadn't just been watching him. They'd been mapping his movements, cataloging every corner of his property. Then he saw something that made his blood freeze. A blinking red dot near the edge of his house. Someone was there right now. Ethan bolted back to his truck, adrenaline surging through him as he sped down the ridge, tires skidding across the gravel. As his house came into view, he saw a flash of movement near the garage, a figure dressed in black disappearing around the corner. Ethan slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and raised the rifle. "Get the hell off my property!" The figure didn't stop. Ethan fired a warning shot into the ground, the rifle's sharp crack echoing through the trees. This time, the figure froze, slowly turning and raising their hands in surrender. Ethan advanced cautiously, keeping the rifle trained on them as the floodlights kicked on, illuminating the intruder's face. It wasn't one of Laura's goons. It was a young woman, no older than 30, with dark hair tied back in a braid. She wore black cargo pants and a tactical jacket, but there was no malice in her expression, only exhaustion. "Don't shoot," she said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then why are you sneaking around my house?" Ethan growled. The woman lowered her hands slightly. "Because you're in danger, Mr. Blake. They won't stop until they take everything you have. If you don't listen to me, you're going to lose this fight." Ethan stared at her, the rifle still raised, every instinct telling him not to trust her. But something in her tone, the quiet urgency, the hint of fear she tried to conceal, gave him pause. "Who are you?" he demanded. She hesitated, then said, "My name's Maya. I used to work for Secure Tech. I know what they're doing and how to stop it." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt his certainty waver. He didn't trust her, but he couldn't ignore the weight of her words. If she was telling the truth, this wasn't just about the HOA or petty fines. It was something far worse, and it was coming for him. Ethan didn't lower the rifle. The woman, Maya, if that was even her real name, held her ground, hands still raised in what felt like a rehearsed act of compliance. She was calm, too calm for someone facing down a loaded gun, and that fact made her seem either brave, reckless, or exactly the kind of trouble he didn't need. "You've got 30 seconds to explain what you're doing here," Ethan said, his voice low and flat. Maya replied, "I'm calling the sheriff. If the sheriff was going to help you, they'd have done it by now." "You've noticed, haven't you? How they don't show up when the HOA calls, but they're here the second you push back. Someone's bought them, Mr. Blake, and it's not Laura Davis versus Secure Tech. She's just their pawn." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about Secure Tech?" "I worked for them for 3 years," Maya said quickly, seizing on his hesitation. "They're not just a tech company. They specialize in surveillance, acquisition, and control. They partner with homeowner associations to upgrade neighborhoods, but the upgrades are a smokescreen. They use HOA bylaws to get what they really want: land, leverage, and compliance. Your property isn't just valuable because of its size, it's what's underneath it." Ethan frowned. Maya gestured toward the house, her hand hovering cautiously in midair. "Can we talk inside? Out here, we might as well be on camera for a moment." Ethan considered turning her in, handing her off to whatever crooked sheriff would show up next, but something about her rang true. Even if he hated to admit it, he'd spent his life reading people, trusting his gut when others second-guessed theirs. His gut told him Maya wasn't lying, at least not about the important parts. He stepped back and nodded toward the porch, motioning for Maya to follow. She walked ahead of him, careful to keep her hands visible. Inside, Ethan locked the door and turned off the floodlights, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow of his security monitors. He watched her eyes flicker to the screens. "They've been here more than you realize," she murmured. "Start talking." Ethan ordered her to set the rifle down within reach. Maya exhaled slowly, rubbing her hands together as if trying to warm them. Months ago, Secure Tech began surveying areas like this: rural properties, private roads, land outside major developments. They're looking for prime locations to expand something they call Project Grid, a pilot program combining surveillance and infrastructure control. Think private roads that can be locked down remotely, underground access points for utilities, properties that can be repurposed for high-value contracts. "You're saying they want my land for infrastructure?" Ethan asked. "Not just infrastructure," Maya corrected. "They believe there's an underground water source here. Natural fresh water is a gold mine in today's market. If they control access to it, they control everything around it. Laura Davis's HOA is just a tool. They feed her promises of profit and development, and she does their dirty work. Fines, foreclosure threats, forced compliance. It's a playbook I've seen before." Ethan ran a hand over his jaw, the pieces clicking together in his mind like tumblers in a lock. He thought of the buried cables, the shed in the woods, the precise placement of the spikes. This wasn't some arbitrary display of power. Secure Tech had been planning this for months, maybe longer. Laura was smug and self-satisfied, likely thinking she was in charge when she was little more than a pawn herself. "How do you know all this?" Ethan asked. Maya hesitated, then said, "I quit when I realized what they were doing, but not before I took files, maps, contracts, names of their clients. I knew I couldn't stop them alone. But someone like you, exactly the kind of problem they don't know how to handle." Ethan almost laughed. "You've got a hell of a lot of faith in someone you just met." "Not faith," Maya said, meeting his eyes with desperation. Before he could respond, one of the monitors flickered, drawing his attention. The camera feed for the western perimeter had gone black. "Damn it, what is it?" Maya asked sharply. Ethan grabbed the rifle, flicking off the safety as he moved toward the back door. Maya followed closely behind, a tense shadow at his heels. Outside, the night was unnervingly quiet. The forest pressed in like a wall of darkness, and the air smelled faintly of smoke. Ethan's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the trees as he approached the broken camera. When he reached it, the housing was smashed, wires dangling like severed veins. He crouched to inspect the damage, and that's when he noticed the footprints. Heavy, deliberate tracks leading deeper into the woods. "They're watching us," Maya whispered. Ethan rose, scanning the darkness with narrowed eyes. Let them watch. They're not ready for what happens next. But the next move wasn't his. It was theirs. When they returned to the house, Ethan saw it immediately. The front door had been forced open. A cold dread settled in his chest. He stepped inside, rifle raised, sweeping the room. Papers were scattered across the floor. Cabinet doors hung open. His tools, his files, his life had been rifled through like trash. Maya picked up one of the envelopes from the floor and held it up to the light. "They're looking for something," she said. Ethan didn't respond until his gaze fell on the table near the window, where a burning matchbook smoldered against a stack of his records. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stamping it out before the fire could spread. The matchbook was from a bar in town, a place Ethan hadn't visited in years. Scrawled across the inside cover were 3 words in neat block letters. "Get out now." Maya stared at it, then looked back at Ethan. "They're giving you a chance to run." Ethan crushed the matchbook in his fist. "I'm not running." "Then you better be ready to fight," Maya said grimly. Over the next few hours, Ethan transformed his house into a fortress. Every remaining camera was recalibrated, motion sensors replaced, and floodlights adjusted to cover the blind spots. Maya helped him, working silently and efficiently. Her presence was oddly reassuring despite the circumstances. By dawn, the property looked like a war zone in waiting. As Ethan locked the gate and stared down the empty road, he thought about the people behind this. The suits and boardrooms, the smug executives who saw his land as numbers on a ledger. They didn't know him, didn't understand what he was capable of. Laura Davis might have been their puppet, but she had made one critical mistake, underestimating him. Ethan Blake didn't lose battles. He didn't back down. The morning air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. Ethan stood at the edge of his porch, shotgun resting on his shoulder, staring down the long, winding road leading to his gate. The land felt different now, violated, almost as if it could sense the impending threat. It wasn't paranoia or some old ghost from his past life. This was real, orchestrated, and deliberate. The events of the past few days had unraveled his patience thread by thread. First the spikes, then the devices, and now the house. Break in with its not-so-subtle message to leave. Secure Tech Solutions and Laura Davis's HOA hadn't just tried to intimidate him. They were declaring war. Ethan had fortified his home, turning the property into a fortress of wires, lights, and steel. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't stop them. People like Laura and her hired men didn't operate in half measures. If they wanted his land, they wouldn't ask again. Maya sat on the steps beside him, tying back her dark hair and checking the magazine of a small pistol she'd pulled from her pack. She had spent the night mapping out every blind spot around the property, identifying where she thought they'd strike first. Ethan hadn't asked where she learned to do any of it. He didn't care. They'd come. "They'll come at sunrise," Maya said, breaking the silence. "It's what they do. Hit hard and fast while you're tired and distracted." Ethan glanced at the sky, a faint strip of pale gold creeping over the horizon. "Then they're already late," he replied. A sudden crack rang out in the distance, a sharp, unmistakable gunshot. Jackson's instincts kicked in immediately. "Get inside," he snapped, grabbing Maya's arm and pulling her toward the door. They barely made it inside when a second shot echoed through the trees, this time closer, followed by the low rumble of tires. Ethan dropped to a crouch near the window and peered out. 2 black SUVs were rolling up the gravel road toward his gate, their headlights cutting through the thin mist. Behind them came a large, boxy truck, industrial, heavy-duty, the kind used to haul construction equipment or worse. His gut told him it was worse. Secure Tech. Maya whispered, crouched beside him. "Who else?" Ethan muttered, "I don't know." He grabbed his rifle, the weight of it familiar and comforting. "Stay low. They're not here to talk." The SUV stopped just short of the gate. Ethan could see figures in dark tactical gear dismounting, moving with the precision of hired mercenaries. These weren't Laura's thugs anymore. They were professionals. One approached the gate with a pair of bolt cutters, slicing through the lock with practiced ease. The heavy clang of metal hitting the ground echoed across the property. "Here we go," Ethan murmured, his pulse steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. The mercenaries poured through the gate, weapons in hand, fanning out as they advanced toward the house. Ethan took a deep breath and aimed through the narrow slit of an open window. He fired a single shot, the rifle's crack deafening in the small room. One of the men dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the ground. The others scattered for cover, shouting orders to each other. "They're splitting up," Maya said, watching from another window. "Some are flanking left." Ethan moved quickly, reloading as he sprinted toward the back of the house. He could hear the thud of boots on the ground and the creep of branches snapping underfoot. For a moment, he thought about his old life, years spent outsmarting bigger threats, surviving when he had no right to. Every lesson he'd learned, every dirty trick he'd played, had led to this moment. The first man came around the corner of the house, crouched low with his weapon raised. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped out and swung the butt of his rifle into the man's face, sending him sprawling to the ground. Another figure appeared behind him, but Maya fired 2 clean shots from the back door, taking down the second man before he could react. "This isn't sustainable," Maya hissed, reloading her pistol. "There are too many of them." Ethan knew she was right. He'd picked a fight he couldn't win alone, but damned if he was going to let these bastards take his land without paying a price. "We'll draw them into the woods," he said. "I've got traps set, wires, pits. They won't be ready for it." They moved quickly, darting through the back door and into the cover of the trees. Ethan knew the land better than anyone, every dip and rise, every fallen log and shadowed clearing. He led Maya deeper into the woods, weaving between the trees as the sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed behind them. One of the mercenaries triggered a tripwire and an explosion of light erupted as a homemade flashbang went off, disorienting the group. Ethan used the distraction to take out 2 more men with his rifle, steady and deliberate. These professionals were good, but they weren't accustomed to fighting someone on his own turf. "Where's the truck?" Maya asked urgently. Ethan scanned the tree line and spotted the large vehicle still parked at the gate, its back doors open. Something about it didn't sit right with him. They weren't just here for them. He realized they were after whatever was underground. The realization hit him like a hammer. It wasn't a siege, it was an extraction. The water source Maya had mentioned, the equipment beneath his land. They weren't waiting to win this fight through legal channels. They were taking it by force. Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. "We end this now." He sprinted toward the truck, Maya at his side. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, splintering branches and punching into the ground. Ethan didn't stop. He reached the truck, climbed into the cab, and found the ignition already running. They'd left it idling, probably assuming the property would be cleared within minutes. "Get clear!" Ethan shouted at Maya, who dove behind a nearby tree. He jammed the gear shift into drive, slammed his foot onto the accelerator, and sent the truck barreling forward. It smashed through the broken gate with a metallic screech, skidding across the gravel road. As Ethan aimed it toward the edge of the ravine, he jumped from the cab just as the truck hurtled over the edge, tumbling downward in a cascade of metal and dirt. The sound of its impact was thunderous, followed by the deep concussive boom of an explosion as whatever equipment they'd stored inside ignited on impact. Fire erupted from the ravine, smoke billowing into the sky. The remaining mercenaries froze, their plans in ruins. Ethan stepped into view, rifle in hand, silhouetted against the blaze. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice carrying through the clearing like a final warning. One by one, the mercenaries retreated, disappearing into the smoke and trees. The battle was over, but Ethan knew the war was far from won. Laura and SecureTech would return. He was certain of that. But next time, they wouldn't catch him off guard. Maya emerged from the woods, covered in dirt and sweat. She stared at Ethan, her expression unreadable. "You just declared war on a corporation. she said softly. Ethan exhaled, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. Yeah, he replied quietly, and I'm just getting started. The sun hung low in the sky as Ethan Blake sat on the edge of his porch, the faint smell of smoke still lingering in the cold air. The clearing looked like a battlefield, charred earth near the ravine where the truck had exploded, shattered pieces of metal scattered like shrapnel, and the broken remnants of his gate hanging uselessly on twisted hinges. The forest beyond remained quiet, the silence no longer comforting but heavy, as if the world itself was waiting for the next blow. He ran a hand over the stubble on his face, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in his bones. The mercenaries were gone, at least for now. After the explosion, they'd scattered, retreating like wolves that knew they'd picked the wrong prey. Ethan had seen their kind before, hired hands who valued a paycheck over loyalty. They didn't come back when the cost outweighed the reward, but SecureTech wasn't done with him, not yet. You know this isn't over, Maya said softly, leaning against the porch railing. Her dark hair fell loose around her face, streaked with dirt and sweat. There was something unreadable in her expression. Admiration, maybe mixed with sadness she tried to hide. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the road where the black SUVs had disappeared hours earlier. They'll regroup. Try again with lawyers, contracts, and fines. Next time, it'll be a suit at my door, not a gun. What's your plan? Maya asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled matchbook they'd found during the break-in. Get out now, still printed in those neat, deliberate letters. He turned it over in his fingers, the paper worn and smudged, a reminder of the warning he'd ignored. Someone inside SecureTech had tried to tip him off to save him from all this, but Ethan wasn't the kind of man who ran. He never had been. They underestimated me, he said finally, his voice low but steady. People like Laura Davis and the suit she works for think they can take whatever they want. They hide behind legal means, hire muscle to do their dirty work, and count on people folding when pushed hard enough. He glanced at Maya, his gaze hard. I don't fold. Maya studied him for a long moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They'll come back with more resources, more pressure. They'll keep pushing until your blood dries or you're locked up. Let them try. Ethan said, we stand our ground. He stood, stretching his shoulders as he looked toward the broken gate. The fire in the ravine had burned itself out, leaving behind a scar of scorched earth. It wasn't pretty, but it was his land, his road, his fight. They hadn't taken that from him yet. The faint rumble of an engine broke the quiet. Ethan turned his head sharply as a battered white pickup truck appeared at the property's edge, crawling up the gravel road. Maya tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the pistol tucked into her waistband. But Ethan shook his head. Easy, he said. The truck rolled to a stop and the door creaked open. An older man stepped out, his boots kicking up dust as he walked. Ethan recognized him instantly. Harvey Turner, one of the oldest residents in the area, a man who'd lived here longer than any HOA ever existed. He was a quiet type, kept to himself, but Ethan had always respected him. Harvey took a long look at the destruction before turning his gaze to Ethan. You could say that, Ethan replied. Harvey nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the blackened dirt and the shattered gate. Word's getting around. Laura's got a lot of folks. She's been knocking on doors, talking about easements and shared property lines. Says this whole area is getting revitalized. Ethan echoed bitterly. Sounds like a fancy word for stolen. Harvey gave a grunt of agreement. You're not wrong. Some folks are starting to see it for what it is. They just don't know what to do about it. Ethan looked at him carefully. Why are you here? Harvey shrugged, his face weathered but resolute. Figured someone ought to stand with the guy who stood up first. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than they had any right to be. Ethan felt something shift, subtle but significant. Harvey's presence, his quiet support, was like a crack in the foundation Laura and SecureTech had built. For the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't alone. People were watching, waiting, some afraid, but others angry just like him. "Laura's days are numbered," Harvey said, looking Ethan square in the eye. "They can't bully everyone forever." Ethan allowed himself a small, grim smile. "We'll see." As Harvey climbed back into his truck and drove away, Maya stepped beside Ethan. "So that's it? You're staying here, waiting for them to come back?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out over the land, the scarred road, the forest that still stood tall despite everything, the house he'd built with his own hands. He could hear the faint chirp of birds returning to the trees, the world waking up as if nothing had happened. "I'm not just waiting," he said finally. "I'm digging in." Maya tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "It means next time they come," Ethan replied, his voice calm and unshakable. "I'll be ready, and I won't be the only one." The sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the property with light. It washed over the broken gate, the burn marks in the dirt, and the faint smoke rising from the ravine. To anyone else, it might have looked like a war zone, a place defeated and abandoned. But to Ethan Blake, it was something else entirely. It was a warning, and it wasn't for him.